If we don't get her on that plane tonight, your daughter may lose her only chance to survive." The airline employee's voice barely reached Ethan Walker through the roar of thunder, shaking the airport windows. Outside, rain slammed against the glass in violent waves while emergency lights reflected across the flooded runway like broken streaks of fire. Ethan tightened his grip around 12-year-old Sophie as she slept weakly against his chest beneath a gray hospital blanket. She felt lighter than she should have. Far too light. Just 6 months earlier, Sophie had been running barefoot through their backyard in Charleston, laughing while holding sketchbooks filled with little houses by the ocean. Now her body trembled from exhaustion every few minutes, even while sleeping. Ethan looked down at the oxygen monitor clipped to her finger. The numbers flickered again. Too low. The storm had already delayed their international flight for almost 24 hours, and somewhere on the other side of the world, a donor kidney was waiting. A kidney that might save his little girl's life, or disappear forever if they arrived too late. "Dad?" Sophie whispered weakly without opening her eyes. Ethan lowered his head immediately. "I'm here, sweetheart." Her lips moved slowly as another roll of thunder echoed across the terminal. "Do you think the ocean there is really blue?" Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Even now, after months of hospitals, needles, dialysis treatments, and sleepless nights, Sophie still thought about the ocean. He forced himself to smile. Bluer than anywhere else in the world. Sophie nodded faintly before drifting back into silence against him. Ethan stared toward the storm outside and tried not to let fear take over his mind again. Fear had become part of his life ever since the diagnosis. He had survived years overseas during military deployments in the Middle East. He had walked through places where most people would have frozen in terror. Back then, he thought he understood what fear truly felt like. He was wrong. Real fear was sitting in an airport at 2 a.m. while your daughter's heartbeat weakened one day at a time. Real fear was knowing money could no longer protect the people you loved. Real fear was watching doctors avoid eye contact because they no longer had answers. A few feet away, Claire sat silently beside a pile of luggage, her face pale from exhaustion. She had not slept properly in days either. Every few minutes she glanced toward the departure screen hanging above the terminal, as if staring hard enough might force the word delayed to disappear. Around them, tired travelers lay across rows of airport seats while television screens repeated weather alerts nonstop. Ethan barely noticed any of it anymore. His entire world had narrowed down to a single countdown ticking invisibly inside his head. 7 days. Then 6. Then 5. Now only hours remained before the hospital overseas would be forced to give the donor organ to another patient. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the email from the surgeon. This is her best chance. Not guaranteed. Not certain. Just a chance. The thunder outside slowly faded into distant rumbles. Then suddenly, across the terminal speakers, a calm voice finally broke through the noise. "Attention passengers on Flight 247 to Da Nang. Boarding preparations will begin shortly." Ethan opened his eyes instantly. Claire covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. For the first time in months, something inside Ethan felt dangerously close to hope. 3 months earlier, Ethan Walker still believed hard work could solve almost anything. At 53 years old, he had built his life the same way he survived every difficult chapter before it, by refusing to quit. His construction and freight company outside Charleston had started with one used pickup truck, a rented storage lot, and years of sleepless nights after returning home from military service overseas. The scars on his shoulders still ached whenever storms rolled through South Carolina, and there were nights when memories from the desert still pulled him awake before sunrise. But Ethan had learned how to live with those things quietly. What mattered most now was the life he had built afterward. Every evening, when he drove through the iron gates of their small property, near the marshlands, Sophie would already be waiting by the front porch holding one of her sketchbooks against her chest. "Dad, look what I drew today." That was usually the first thing she said before he even turned off the truck engine. Sophie loved drawing little beach houses with wide windows facing the ocean. Some had blue shutters. Some had flower gardens. Some had wooden docks stretching into calm water at sunset. Ethan used to joke that one day she would design an entire town by the sea. Sophie always laughed and shook her head. "No, I want to be a doctor." "A doctor?" Ethan asked once while helping her clean paint from her fingers at the kitchen sink. "Why not an artist?" Sophie smiled softly. Because doctors saved you after the war. Ethan had looked away for a moment after hearing that. Claire noticed it immediately, but said nothing. She simply rested her hand gently against his back, while Sophie kept talking about hospitals, nurses, and all the people she wanted to help someday. Back then, everything still felt normal. Their home smelled like coffee every morning and sea salt candles every evening. Claire taught piano lessons 3 days a week, while Ethan spent most afternoons traveling between construction sites. Sophie rode her bike along the neighborhood sidewalks after school and spent hours sitting beside the living room window sketching sunsets she had never actually seen in person. Then one afternoon, everything changed with a single phone call from the school nurse. Sophie had fainted during science class. At first, Ethan assumed she was exhausted or dehydrated from the summer heat. But over the following weeks, she became weaker. Her energy disappeared little by little. She stopped riding her bike. Then came the headaches, the nausea, the endless doctor appointments. Ethan still remembered the exact sound the kidney specialist made before speaking. A quiet breath, a hesitation, the kind doctors used when they were about to change someone's life forever. Your daughter has advanced kidney failure. Claire immediately covered her mouth with both hands. Ethan just stared at the doctor without blinking. He heard every word afterward, but none of it fully reached him. Dialysis, treatment options, national transplant waiting lists, severe progression, time sensitive. The room suddenly felt too small to breathe inside. That night, Ethan sat alone in the driveway long after everyone went to sleep. The humid South Carolina air wrapped around him while cicadas buzzed in the trees nearby. Inside the house, Sophie's bedroom lights still glowed faintly through the second-floor window. She was probably drawing again. Ethan lowered his head into his hands for the first time in years. He had faced uncertainty before. He had survived fear before. But this was different. Because this time, the person slipping away was not him. The following months slowly transformed the Walker family home into something unrecognizable. Hospital schedules replaced weekend plans. Pill bottles crowded the kitchen counters beside untouched coffee mugs. Sophie's colorful drawings still covered the refrigerator door, but now there were medical calendars taped between them filled with appointments, blood tests, and dialysis sessions. Ethan began waking before dawn almost every day to drive Sophie to treatment, while Claire packed blankets, snacks, and sketchbooks into a faded canvas bag they now carried everywhere. At first, Sophie tried very hard to pretend nothing had changed. She still smiled whenever nurses entered the room. She still thanked every doctor politely. During her dialysis sessions, she often sat quietly near the hospital window sketching little oceans and beach houses while machines hummed beside her. One afternoon, a nurse stopped beside her chair and asked what she was drawing. Sophie held up the picture proudly. It showed a tiny white house sitting beside bright blue water under an orange sunset. "That is where we are going someday," Sophie said softly. Ethan forced himself to smile when he heard that, but later that evening he sat alone in his truck outside the hospital parking garage for nearly an hour staring at the steering wheel. Deep down, fear had already started growing inside him like something heavy and permanent. The treatments were not helping enough. Sophie's energy continued disappearing week after week. Her cheeks became thinner. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Sometimes she became so weak she needed help walking from the car to the front door. Ethan hated those moments most of all. Every instinct inside him screamed to fix this somehow, but nothing he did seemed to matter. He contacted private specialists in Boston, Houston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. He spent thousands of dollars arranging consultations with some of the best kidney experts in the country. Every answer sounded almost identical. Sophie needed a transplant, and there were simply too many patients waiting already. Ethan had built his entire adult life believing preparation and determination could solve nearly anything. But medicine did not care about money or business success. There were no shortcuts, no guarantees, only waiting, endless waiting. Some nights Ethan sat beside Sophie's hospital bed while she slept and watched the heart monitor blink slowly in the darkness. The soft electronic rhythm became the soundtrack of his life. Beep, pause, beep, pause. Every time the sound slowed, even slightly, panic rushed through his chest before reason could catch up. Claire tried to stay strong for both of them, but Ethan noticed the quiet ways exhaustion was wearing her down too. She barely touched food anymore. She often stood silently at the kitchen sink long after midnight, staring into the backyard without saying anything. Once, Ethan found her crying quietly while folding Sophie's laundry. Neither of them knew what to say anymore that had not already been said 100 times before. Then came the night Ethan would never forget. Rain hammered against the hospital windows while Sophie lay unconscious after collapsing during treatment earlier that evening. Machines surrounded her bed, their soft lights glowing blue in the darkness. A doctor finally asked Ethan to step into the hallway. The man removed his glasses slowly before speaking. "Her body is getting weaker faster than we expected." Ethan felt his throat tighten immediately. "What are you saying?" The doctor hesitated for a moment. "If we do not find a compatible donor soon, I am not sure how much longer she can continue waiting." Ethan stared at the floor tiles beneath his boots while the words echoed inside his head over and over again. He had survived deserts, storms, injuries, and years of nightmares after the war. But standing under those hospital lights that night, Ethan Walker felt truly helpless for the first time in his entire life. After the doctor walked away, Ethan remained alone in the hospital hallway long after midnight, while the storm outside slowly faded into silence. The fluorescent ceiling lights cast pale reflections across the empty floor, and somewhere down the corridor a machine beeped steadily behind a closed door. Ethan sat with both hands pressed together, staring at nothing. For years people had called him strong. Employees depended on him. Friends admired him. Even Claire often joked that Ethan Walker could survive anything life threw at him. But strength felt meaningless sitting there outside his daughter's hospital room while time quietly slipped away. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan finally stood and walked toward the vending machines near the waiting area. He bought a black coffee, even though he did not really want it. The paper cup trembled slightly in his hand from exhaustion. Across the television mounted near the ceiling, a weather channel played silently while subtitles warned about heavy rain moving along the East Coast. Ethan barely noticed. His mind kept replaying the doctor's words over and over again. "I'm not sure how much longer she can continue waiting." He closed his eyes briefly. Then suddenly, he heard Sophie's voice in his memory from years earlier. "Dad, look at the sunset." He could almost see her standing barefoot near the marsh behind their house with crayons staining her fingers. Ethan lowered his head and felt his chest tighten painfully. For the first time since returning home from the war, he prayed. Not quietly, not politely, desperately. Before sunrise, Ethan drove through nearly empty streets toward a small church a few miles from the hospital. Rainwater still glistened across the sidewalks beneath the streetlights. He had not entered a church in years, maybe decades. The building looked small and old between 2 oak trees draped with Spanish moss. A dim light still glowed near the entrance. Ethan stepped inside slowly. The sanctuary smelled faintly like wood polish and candle wax. Everything felt still, peaceful in a way the hospital never could. He sat alone in the last pew and stared toward the stained glass windows, while dawn slowly began coloring the sky outside. For several minutes, he said nothing at all. Then finally the words came out quietly. "Please do not take my little girl." His voice cracked on the final word. Ethan lowered his face into his hands. A few moments later, soft footsteps echoed nearby. An elderly pastor with silver hair approached carefully and sat beside him without speaking at first. "Long night?" the man asked gently. Ethan nodded once. The pastor introduced himself as Benjamin Hayes and listened quietly while Ethan explained everything. The diagnosis, the waiting lists, the treatments, the fear that grew worse every single day. Ethan spoke for nearly 20 minutes without realizing it. Pastor Hayes never interrupted. When Ethan finally fell silent, the old man rested one hand gently against his shoulder. "Sometimes," he said softly, "when life becomes too heavy for one person to carry alone, hope arrives through people we have never even met yet." Ethan looked at him quietly. "What if hope never comes?" Pastor Hayes smiled faintly. "Then you keep searching until it does." Those words stayed with Ethan long after he left the church later that morning. When he returned to Sophie's hospital room, he found her awake again, sitting weakly against her pillows with a sketchbook resting on her knees. Her hands looked smaller now, fragile, but she still smiled the moment she saw him. "Dad," she whispered softly, "I finished the picture." Ethan walked closer and looked down. Sophie had drawn a tiny beach house beside bright blue water. 2 small figures sat together watching the sunset, while another figure cooked dinner near the porch lights. "That is us," Sophie said quietly. Ethan stared at the drawing for several seconds before speaking. "We are going there someday." Sophie smiled tiredly. "Promise." Ethan pulled a chair beside her bed and took her hand carefully in his. "I promise." And for the first time in months, Ethan realized he could not afford to lose hope before she did. That same afternoon, Ethan drove home for the first time in nearly 2 days just to shower and change clothes before returning to the hospital. The house felt strangely quiet without Sophie's laughter drifting through the hallways. Her shoes still sat near the front door beside a pink backpack she had not touched in weeks. Half-finished drawings remained scattered across the dining room table exactly where she left them. Ethan paused beside one sketch showing a little beach cafe beside palm trees and bright blue water. At the top of the page Sophie had written in careful handwriting, "Someday." Ethan swallowed hard and looked away. He moved slowly through the kitchen while coffee brewed in silence. The refrigerator hummed softly beside him. Outside, sunlight reflected across the backyard pond while wind stirred the marsh grass beyond the fence line. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But inside Ethan felt like the world had already started breaking apart piece by piece. He opened his laptop at the kitchen table and stared at the screen for a long time without typing anything. Then finally he remembered Pastor Hayes' words. "Hope arrives through people we have never even met yet." Ethan exhaled slowly and opened a social media page he had barely used in years. At first he did not know what to write. How could a few paragraphs possibly explain the fear swallowing his family whole every single day? But eventually the words began coming on their own. Ethan posted a photo of Sophie smiling beside one of her ocean drawings before her illness became severe. He explained her condition, the transplant waiting list, the endless treatments, the uncertainty, and finally, he wrote one sentence that felt almost impossible for him to admit out loud. "I do not know how to save my daughter anymore." After posting it, Ethan closed the laptop and immediately regretted everything. He hated asking strangers for sympathy. But over the following hours, messages slowly began appearing from people across the country. Parents who had survived similar battles. Nurses offering encouragement. Organ donor advocates sharing information. Former military friends he had not spoken to in years. Ethan read every message late into the night while sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed after she fell asleep. Then around 2 in the morning, a notification appeared from someone named Noah Bennett. Ethan almost ignored it at first, but something about the message caught his attention immediately. "A hospital overseas saved my life when American doctors thought I would never recover." Ethan frowned slightly and opened the message. Noah explained that several months earlier he had suffered a devastating accident while traveling through Southeast Asia. Surgeons in the United States warned him that permanent damage was likely, but doctors at a coastal hospital overseas managed to restore far more function than anyone expected. Noah attached a photo showing a long scar running along his arm beside a caption that read, "Miracles sometimes happen far from home." Ethan stared at the sentence for several seconds. Something deep inside him shifted slightly. Hope. Tiny. Fragile. But real. He immediately replied, asking questions about the hospital, the doctors, the treatment process, anything Noah could remember. To Ethan's surprise, Noah answered almost instantly. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Noah described a city near the ocean filled with tropical rainstorms, quiet cafes, and doctors who treated patients like family instead of numbers. He spoke about kindness from complete strangers, about feeling human again after months of fear. Before sunrise, Noah finally sent Ethan the contact information for the hospital overseas. Ethan looked towards Sophie, sleeping quietly beneath dim hospital lights, while the monitor beside her bed beeped softly in the darkness. Then he opened a blank email and began typing the most important message of his life. Ethan spent the next 48 hours living beside his inbox. Every vibration from his phone sent a surge of anxiety through his chest before disappointment quickly followed again and again. Most messages were polite acknowledgments from medical offices explaining that international consultations required time and review. But the hospital Noah mentioned remained completely silent. During the day, Ethan continued sitting beside Sophie through dialysis sessions while pretending to stay calm. At night, after Claire finally fell asleep in the reclining chair near the hospital window, Ethan refreshed his email over and over beneath the pale glow of his phone screen. He barely noticed time passing anymore. Everything in his world had narrowed into waiting. Sophie, however, still tried to hold on to normal moments whenever she could. One afternoon, she sat quietly in bed sketching while rain drifted softly against the hospital windows. Ethan watched her from across the room while reviewing insurance paperwork he no longer believed mattered much. Sophie suddenly looked up and smiled faintly. "Dad, yes, sweetheart. Do you think people can miss places they have never even seen before?" Ethan lowered the papers slowly. "What do you mean?" Sophie held up her drawing. This time she had painted waves rolling onto a bright shoreline beneath palm trees, swaying in the wind. "I keep dreaming about the ocean," she whispered. Ethan tried to answer, but before he could speak, his phone vibrated sharply in his pocket. He pulled it out absent-mindedly at first. Then his heart nearly stopped. The message was from the hospital overseas. Ethan stood so quickly his chair scraped loudly across the floor. Claire looked up immediately. Ethan opened the email with trembling hands while Sophie watched silently from the bed. The message was brief but direct. The medical team had reviewed Sophie's records and wanted additional scans, blood work history, and transplant evaluations sent immediately for further analysis. Ethan read the email 3 times before speaking. They responded. Claire covered her mouth as tears instantly filled her eyes. Sophie simply stared at her parents quietly, trying to understand whether this was good news or just another temporary possibility. Ethan spent the next several days gathering every medical document imaginable. He moved between specialists, imaging centers, insurance offices, and hospital administrators with relentless focus. Some nights he barely slept more than an hour. Yet for the first time in months, exhaustion no longer felt empty. There was purpose behind it now. Hope, small but growing stronger every day. Then finally, 1 week later, the second email arrived. Ethan was sitting alone inside his office when his laptop chimed softly. Sunlight filtered through the blinds across stacks of unfinished construction contracts and shipping invoices he had completely ignored for weeks. He almost did not open the message immediately because he feared another delay or rejection. But the moment he began reading, the room around him seemed to disappear entirely. The hospital had identified a compatible donor kidney from a patient who had recently suffered irreversible brain injury. The transplant team believed Sophie was a strong match. However, there was one condition. She needed to arrive at the hospital within 7 days before the organ would be reassigned to another patient on the waiting list. Ethan stared at the screen in complete silence. His hands slowly covered his face while tears finally escaped for the first time in years. Not from weakness, from relief, from fear, from the crushing realization that after months of darkness, there was finally a path forward for his daughter. But attached to that hope was a brutal countdown already ticking away. 7 days. Ethan immediately sold the restored vintage Mustang he had spent years rebuilding in his garage. He postponed every business contract indefinitely and began arranging emergency passports, medical clearance forms, and international travel documentation. Yet even while preparing for the journey, another terrifying reality continued hanging over them. Sophie's body was growing weaker faster than anyone expected. 2 days before departure, Ethan overheard one of the doctors speaking quietly to Claire near the hallway nurse's station. "I am honestly not sure she is strong enough for a flight that long." Ethan felt cold panic rise through him all over again. But later that evening, Sophie reached for his hand weakly from her hospital bed and whispered something that stayed with him forever. "Dad, I still want to see the ocean." The morning of their departure arrived beneath dark storm clouds rolling across the Charleston skyline. Ethan barely slept the night before. Every hour mattered now. Every delay felt dangerous. Sophie sat quietly in a wheelchair near the airport terminal windows wrapped in a light blue blanket, while Claire organized medications, passports, and medical records for the 3rd time that morning. Outside, sheets of rain pounded the runway hard enough to blur the distant lights completely. Travelers crowded around airline counters while overhead announcements repeated weather warnings every few minutes. Ethan checked the departure board again. Delayed. He closed his eyes briefly and tried to steady his breathing. Sophie noticed immediately. "Dad?" she whispered softly. "It is okay." Ethan knelt beside her chair and forced a smile. "We are getting there. I promised you." Sophie nodded weakly before turning toward the rain outside. She looked so fragile now that Ethan sometimes struggled to recognize the energetic little girl who used to ride her bicycle through the neighborhood after school. Her skin had become pale from months of treatment. Most of her hair had thinned away beneath the knit cap Claire gently adjusted every few minutes. Yet somehow Sophie still managed to smile whenever she looked at her parents. As the storm intensified, airport employees began announcing additional cancellations around the terminal. Ethan felt panic building slowly inside his chest again. He walked toward the large windows overlooking the runway and stared at the violent weather swallowing the airfield. For one terrifying moment, he imagined the donor kidney being reassigned while they remained trapped thousands of miles away. He imagined returning to the hospital in Charleston with no options left. His hands tightened into fists inside his jacket pockets. Then, almost unbelievably, sometime after sunrise, the storm finally began weakening. The thunder faded first. Then the rain softened into scattered mist drifting across the runway. Slowly, patches of pale blue sky appeared above the horizon. Around the terminal, exhausted passengers began lifting their heads toward the windows again. Finally, after nearly 24 hours of uncertainty, the boarding announcement echoed across the speakers. Ethan felt Claire grab his arm tightly, while relief flooded through both of them at once. During the 14-hour journey across the Pacific, Ethan barely moved from his seat beside Sophie. Most of the flight, she slept curled beneath blankets while the steady hum of the aircraft engines filled the cabin. Occasionally, turbulence shook the plane gently, causing Ethan to glance nervously toward the medical monitor clipped to Sophie's finger. Every time she stirred awake, he handed her water carefully or adjusted the small pillow beneath her head. Claire rested quietly across the aisle, though Ethan could tell she was not truly sleeping either. Somewhere above the ocean, while most passengers sat in darkness watching movies or sleeping, Ethan stared through the airplane window into the endless black sky outside. For years after the war, he believed he had already traveled farther emotionally than any person should ever have to go. But now he realized something different. Fear for yourself was survivable. Fear for your child changed you completely. By the time the plane finally descended toward the coastal city overseas, sunlight had begun spilling across the horizon in soft orange streaks. Ethan looked out the window and froze quietly. Below them stretched endless green coastline, winding rivers, clusters of colorful buildings, and bright blue ocean shining beneath the morning sun. Palm trees swayed beside narrow roads while fishing boats drifted near the shore like tiny white dots against the water. It looked nothing like the cold hospital corridors that had consumed their lives for months. The moment they stepped outside the airport, warm tropical air wrapped around them, carrying the faint smell of rain and sea salt together. Sophie opened her eyes slowly from the wheelchair and looked toward the distant coastline beyond the terminal buildings. For the first time in weeks, Ethan saw genuine light return briefly to her face. "Dad?" she whispered weakly. "The ocean really is blue." The hospital stood only a few blocks from the shoreline, surrounded by tall, tropical trees swaying gently beneath the humid afternoon breeze. As the taxi pulled into the entrance, Ethan expected another cold medical building filled with noise and tension like the hospitals back home. Instead, he noticed sunlight pouring through open hallways lined with plants and wide windows overlooking the sea. Somewhere nearby, he could hear birds singing above the distant sound of waves rolling against the shore. For a moment, it almost did not feel like a hospital at all. Nurses moved quickly but calmly through the corridors while speaking softly to patients and families. Sophie rested weakly in the wheelchair while looking around quietly, taking everything in with tired eyes. Even Claire seemed surprised by the atmosphere. After months of living beneath fluorescent lights and endless machine alarms in Charleston, this place felt strangely human. Within an hour, Sophie was taken for additional blood work, scans, and compatibility testing, while Ethan completed stacks of paperwork beside an interpreter assigned to help international patients. Every minute felt endless. Ethan paced the hallway outside the transplant unit while watching doctors move between rooms carrying charts and medical files. Occasionally, he glanced through nearby windows toward the ocean visible beyond the hospital gardens. The water looked impossibly calm compared to the storm they had just escaped. Late that evening, a woman in navy blue surgical scrubs approached Ethan near the waiting area. She introduced herself as Dr. Lynn Tran, the lead transplant specialist overseeing Sophie's case. Her English carried a gentle accent, but her voice was steady and confident. Ethan stood immediately. "Please," he asked quietly, "just tell me honestly. Does my daughter still have a chance?" Dr. Tran studied him for a moment before answering carefully. "The donor kidney appears highly compatible based on the latest results. That is very rare. We believe surgery is possible." Ethan felt relief hit him so suddenly he nearly lost balance for a second. But Dr. Tran continued, speaking gently. "However, Sophie is very weak. The surgery itself is only one part of the process. Her body must accept the new kidney afterward. There are risks we cannot fully control." Ethan nodded slowly. He appreciated the honesty more than false comfort. Dr. Tran handed him a thick consent form explaining every possible complication. Ethan stared at the pages without really reading them. The words blurred together beneath the harsh weight of responsibility pressing against him. One signature, one decision, one chance. Through a nearby window, he could see Claire sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed while brushing her fingers softly through what remained of Sophie's thin hair. Sophie looked exhausted but peaceful, watching the ocean beyond the balcony outside her room. Ethan finally picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly as he signed the documents at the bottom of each page. Afterward, Dr. Tran rested one hand gently over the folder. "We will do everything possible for her." Ethan whispered a quiet thank you before returning to Sophie's room. The surgery was scheduled for sunrise the following morning. That night, none of them truly slept. Rain drifted softly outside, while warm air moved through the partially opened balcony doors, carrying the smell of salt water into the room. Sophie sat awake near midnight, holding her sketchbook again. Ethan noticed she was adding something new to the beach house drawing she had carried all the way from Charleston. This time she carefully sketched a small wooden boat, floating near the shoreline beneath a large rising sun. Ethan sat beside her quietly. "What is that?" he asked softly. Sophie smiled faintly without looking up from the page. "Tomorrow," she whispered. Ethan looked at the drawing for a long moment before turning toward the dark ocean outside the hospital window. Somewhere beyond the waves and rain, dawn was slowly getting closer. The surgery lasted nearly 10 hours. Ethan spent every minute sitting outside the operating room beneath dim hallway lights, while tropical rain moved steadily across the hospital windows beside him. Time seemed to stop completely. Nurses came and went quietly through the corridor, while distant elevator chimes echoed every few minutes. But Ethan barely noticed any of it anymore. Claire sat beside him with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched coffee that had long since gone cold. Neither of them spoke very much. There was nothing left to say that had not already been whispered 100 times over the past several months. Occasionally, Ethan stood and walked toward the end of the hallway where large windows overlooked the ocean beyond the city. Fishing boats drifted slowly across the gray morning water beneath low clouds while palm trees bent gently in the rain. The peacefulness outside felt unreal compared to the fear tearing through him inside. At one point, Ethan leaned both hands against the glass and closed his eyes. Memories began replaying one after another without warning. Sophie riding on his shoulders during a county fair when she was 6 years old. Sophie falling asleep beside him on the living room couch, while cartoons played quietly in the background. Sophie running barefoot through the backyard, holding another one of her sketchbooks high above her head because she wanted to show him a new drawing before dinner. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cool glass and fought hard to steady himself. Hours later, sometime close to midnight, the operating room doors finally opened. Ethan stood instantly. Dr. Tran stepped into the hallway, removing her surgical mask slowly, while exhaustion showed clearly across her face. For one terrifying second, Ethan could not breathe at all. Then Dr. Tran smiled softly. The surgery was successful. Claire immediately broke down in tears beside him, while Ethan simply stood frozen in place, trying to process the words. Successful. Sophie was alive. The kidney had begun functioning during surgery, but Dr. Tran carefully explained that the next several days remained critical. Sophie's body still needed to accept the transplant fully. There were risks ahead. Complications could still happen. Ethan listened carefully, but somewhere deep inside him, hope had finally become stronger than fear for the first time in months. Recovery came slowly. Some mornings, Sophie barely had enough strength to lift her head from the pillow. Other days, she managed short walks through the hospital garden, holding tightly onto Ethan's arm while warm ocean wind moved through the trees around them. Gradually, little changes began appearing. Her appetite returned first, then color slowly came back to her cheeks. A few weeks later, Ethan noticed her laughing again while watching fishing boats from the balcony outside her room. It was the first real laugh he had heard from her in almost a year. One quiet afternoon near sunset, Ethan pushed Sophie's wheelchair through the hospital courtyard toward a small garden overlooking the shoreline. The sky glowed orange and gold across the water while waves rolled gently against the distant beach below. Sophie reached into her bag and carefully pulled out the sketchbook she had carried all the way from Charleston. Ethan sat beside her quietly while she flipped through page after page of old drawings filled with beach houses, sunsets, and oceans she once only imagined. Then she stopped at the unfinished picture from months earlier. The small house beside the sea, the family sitting together near the porch, the boat floating beyond the shoreline. Slowly, Sophie picked up a pencil and added one final detail to the drawing: a large rising sun stretching light across the water. Ethan watched silently before asking softly, "What does that part mean?" Sophie smiled gently without looking up from the page. "It means we made it to tomorrow." Ethan felt tears fill his eyes again as he looked toward the real ocean glowing beneath the evening sky beyond the garden walls. After everything they had survived together, he finally understood something he never truly learned during all those years after the war. Sometimes miracles are not loud. Sometimes they arrive quietly through strangers, through kindness, through people refusing to give up on each other when life becomes unbearable. And sometimes, the place that saves your life becomes the place that teaches you how to live again.